MYTHICA, A Quest for Heroes. This is actually the first in a planned trilogy of films by Arrowstorm Entertainment. Now, Arrowstorm Entertainment basically are a small independent movie studio that focus primarily on fantasy films. They've done a couple of other ones. They've done a couple of sort of horror movies and sci-fi films, but they generally do fantasy films. And I'm a big fan of the kind of the sword and sorcery genre, so I've kind of keep a close eye on what they put out. And they've done a couple of movies that I really enjoy, like Orc Wars and Saga, the Shadow Cabal. However, they have done a couple of stinkers as well. And, I've been keeping up to date with the kind of production of this film, quite eagerly anticipating its release so I can kind of sit down and enjoy it and obviously give it a review like I am now. So what's the film like? Well, let me tell you a little bit about the story first of all. It really focuses on a young girl called Marek, who's this kind of, I guess, trainee sort of sorceress magician type. And she's kind of a bit of an outcast, and she has a kind of a gammy leg, which will be important later in the story, I'm sure. And she's basically wants to kind of find adventure. And of course she does find it where there happens to be this sort of cleric girl who's seeking a group of heroes to try and rescue her sister, who is being sort of kidnapped by sort of large ogre and some orcs and things. So they kind of agree to help each other, and this Marek tries to find some other sort of heroes types that kind of help her on the way, and she sort of comes across this kind of thief with the heart of gold, of course, and this warrior who's probably the most useless warrior you've ever seen, because he's constantly getting either captured or knocked out about 5 times throughout this movie. And basically the four of them kind of tromps off to try and rescue the sister by chasing after the orc and the ogre and stuff. So that's the basic plot. Now, like I said, this is the first part in a planned trilogy, so there are some seeds set here for occurrences that will basically be in later films. Like we're led to believe that Marek's kind of got some kind of flirtation with like the dark side of the Force, and there appears to be other enemies kind of waiting in the shadows, obviously for future installments as well. So the movie's actually got a brief cameo by Kevin Sorbo in it, and he's going to be important because this is going to kind of lead me into a comparison a little bit later on. So the pluses of this film, so Arrowstorm have got a fairly extensive history of making fantasy films. They kind of know how to make it look appealing to this kind of like sort of sword and sorcery audience. So if you're a fan, you'll appreciate some of the sort of the costume designs and the kind of the aesthetics, the makeup jobs of the orcs and stuff. I mean, this is very, very reminiscent of the kind of the Lord of the Rings movies, and I think some of the story plots here as well are kind of borrowed from the kind of the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit kind of universe, even though it's nothing to do with it, to be honest. So aesthetically, I think it looks quite good. So I think some of the cinematography is quite nice, some of the location shooting is kind of nice, and if you're a fan of like Dungeons and Dragons, for example, you appreciate some of the kind of the character types that we sort of see on display here. So on that respect, I think it's quite good. Now, let me put this, I mentioned Kevin Sorbo. If you are a fan of the kind of fantasy TV shows that we had in the 90s, like Hercules, The Legends of Journeys, Xena, Beastmaster, things like that, you'll probably like this film because it really looks like it should be one of those kind of TV shows. It has this feel of a kind of 90s TV fantasy TV show. That's actually what it kind of looks like, and it's probably down to the fact that obviously this is actually a low budget. I believe it's kind of partly funded by Kickstarter. So if you're a fan of those kind of TV shows, and even the way the kind of the dialogue is, it's kind of like contemporary dialogue really, but obviously set in a kind of fantasy landscape. So very much like those kind of TV shows that I've mentioned. So if you're a fan of those TV shows, I think you'll probably definitely like this movie. But I have got some negatives here. Now, we've mentioned Arrowstorm have had a bit of a mixed bag. So they've had a couple of decent films, I think, fairly well-made films for the budget. But they've also had a couple of kind of films that I think are pretty forgettable and not as good. And they're directed by a lady called Anne Black. And she actually directs and has written this movie, which is a bit of a shame, I have to be honest, because I think her work tends to be some of the lesser work coming out of Arrowstorm. And unfortunately, I see the same problems that I kind of see with the other films that she's done, and that it seems to be that the direction here is very, very pedestrian. It's very kind of flat. This film, because it's the first in the trilogy, really is more sort of character building. However, we don't really feel like we know the characters because they seem such cliches. They seem very, very kind of stereotypical, one-dimensional characters. And considering this movie is meant to be sort of, like I said, the first part of a trilogy, there is probably more time than you'd imagine actually dealt with just talking and kind of meant to be character building, but we simply don't get that. They just seem like stereotypical fantasy archetypes. And like I said, they're kind of the way they are directed just makes them sound quite boring, to be honest. And we're meant to believe that they're kind of, at the end of the movie, they're obviously sort of about friendship and stuff like that, but we really don't see it. We really don't see that build. So that's kind of a bit of a shame, I think. And just generally, so there is a few action sequences. I say that probably the end of this film picks up a little bit, but there's not a lot of action. There's probably, there's a small action scene at the beginning. There's kind of one midway through, which has got strange in it. I have to say the lighting in that middle action scene is kind of, I guess it's meant to be taking place at dusk, but it's really hard to see. And there's kind of an action sort of set piece towards the end, which is probably the highlight of the film. But unfortunately, like I said, the direction here is kind of pedestrian and just makes it for a pretty mundane fantasy film, unfortunately, which is a real shame because I was really hoping this film would be one of the kind of the better ones. I mean, they're never as good, obviously. They don't get any under illusions. These films are never going to be comparable to the kind of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films, but they do a fairly good job if you can kind of look past the kind of the lower budgets a lot of the time. But this one, although it's certainly not a terrible film, and I think it has that kind of that aesthetic that you may like, I think it falls under that kind of slightly below average side of things, which is a shame. So like I said, you can watch this. I think it is self-contained enough that you can watch it as a single film, but obviously the key here is just trying to hook you into kind of watching the rest of this kind of this franchise, I guess. So there are some things that are kind of left sort of unexplained that kind of you may think, what, if you're not quite kind of following it exactly. But this, unfortunately, like I said, is probably, while it's not a bad film, it is unfortunately below average. I did find it kind of mundane, kind of boring, if I'm completely honest, a little bit too much talking without anything to say. So I'm going to give this movie a 4 out of 10. And the thing is, I was kind of maybe wanting to like this film more than I actually did, but I'm going to try and be fair and kind of give my honest opinion on it, which is a shame because I was actually hoping for a bit more. And I'm saying I feel a lot of this is down to the kind of the direction mainly, and the kind of the acting isn't as good as I've seen, and there's a lot of the same actors, and I do feel that's kind of again down to the direction here. So 4 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.